On the 5th of August 2010, a rock collapse sealed 33 miners inside the San Jose mine in northern Chile. The world would later remember the rescue capsule, the cheering crowds, and the number that made the story unforgettable: 69 days underground. But before the drills broke through, before the cameras arrived, and before anyone on the surface even knew the men were alive, something stranger happened in the dark. A group of trapped workers had to decide how they were going to live together. They had almost no food. They had no reliable way out. They did not know whether rescuers were searching in the right place. And for 17 days, they had to survive inside a buried workplace that was turning into something else entirely: an underground society. The collapse happened in the afternoon. A huge mass of rock came down inside the old copper and gold mine, blocking the main access ramp and cutting off the men deep below the Atacama Desert. Dust filled the air. Vehicles were trapped. Escape routes that looked possible at first often led nowhere or ended at blocked passages. The miners gathered in the refuge area, a chamber designed for emergencies. But refuge did not mean comfort. It did not even mean safety in any long-term sense. It meant a place with a little food, a little water, some medical supplies, and the hope that rescue would arrive quickly. That hope became a problem almost immediately. The stored rations were meant for a short emergency, not for 33 adult men facing an unknown weight. Hunger was no longer a future threat. It was a political problem from the first night onward. Who controlled the food? How much would each man receive? Would strong personalities seize more than weaker ones? Would panic destroy discipline before the rescuers ever got close? The shift foreman, Luis Urzua, became the central figure in that first crisis. He was not the president of an underground nation, at least not in any official sense. He was the man with the strongest claim to authority in a buried workplace that still remembered it had once been a workplace. That mattered. In a disaster, people do not begin from nothing. They begin from whatever structure already exists, then improvise from there. Urzua's first great decision was rationing. The men had tins of tuna, a little milk, some biscuits, and not much else. If they ate normally, the food would disappear almost at once, so they did something harsher. They stretched the supply into tiny portions, in some accounts eating only a spoonful or two every 48 hours. That sounds like logistics. It was also government. Rationing is never only about food. It is about legitimacy. It asks whether a group believes the person limiting their survival today is increasing their chance of surviving tomorrow. The miners were tired, frightened, and hungry. Some were experienced veterans of the mine. Others were younger. Some were natural leaders. Some were deeply religious. Some were angry at the company, at management, or at fate itself. All 33 had a vote in the most basic sense that mattered underground. They could cooperate or refuse. By later accounts, the group gradually created an order that mixed hierarchy with consent. Urzua helped coordinate the whole. Others took on roles that made life below more survivable. Mario Sepulveda emerged as a morale booster and spokesman, energetic enough to keep despair from becoming the dominant mood. Mario Gomez, one of the oldest miners, became a kind of elder presence and spiritual anchor. Yoni Barrios, who had some medical experience, became important in monitoring health. Other men handled maintenance, lighting, exploration, sanitation, and the organization of space. They were not writing a constitution, but they were distributing power. That is what makes the story so unusual. A mine collapse did not remove politics. It made politics unavoidable. Somebody had to decide where men slept. Somebody had to organize shifts. Somebody had to decide who explored blocked passages and who stayed behind. Somebody had to enforce cleanliness in extreme conditions, because even underground, disease and disorder could become enemies as dangerous as hunger. And somebody had to settle disagreements in a place where there was nowhere to walk away. Later, Urzua described the group as using a practical majority logic. With 33 men trapped below, 17 votes could settle a question. whether every decision was resolved that formally matters less than what the claim reveals. The men were trying to spread responsibility and give themselves a rule they could all recognize. That was not weakness. It was survival. A dictatorship of one hungry foreman might have broken down quickly. A system in which men believed they were being heard had a better chance of enduring the claustrophobia, fear, and monotony of burial. They also began dividing the underground world itself. Certain zones were kept for sleeping. Other areas were used for work, meetings, or prayer. Men were encouraged to keep routines. The lights and vehicles that still functioned became part of a managed environment rather than a desperate scramble for resources. That may sound mundane. It was not. Routine is one of the oldest tools of survival in extreme confinement. It gives time shape. It keeps fear from occupying every minute. It turns waiting into labor and labor into purpose. In effect, the miners were building a small civic order inside a place designed for extraction, not habitation, and they were doing it while not knowing whether it mattered. That uncertainty defined the first 17 days. On the surface, rescue teams drilled test holes down through the rock, but they did not yet know where the men were. Some holes missed. Families gathered above in growing anguish. A camp emerged around the site. But underground, the men had no guarantee that any of those efforts were reaching them. This is what makes the episode's usual public memory incomplete. We remember the men after they were found. The harder story is how they behaved when they believed they might not be. In that phase, rules mattered more than optimism. Fairness mattered more than speeches. And order mattered more than hope. Then, on the 17th day, a drill finally broke through into the refuge area. The miners attached a note to the drill bit. "We are well in the refuge, the 33. The message turned them from a possible grave into a global event. But contact with the surface did not end the politics underground. It transformed it. Now food, medicine, letters, cameras, and instructions began arriving through narrow boreholes. Officials, doctors, engineers, and psychologists above ground started advising, and sometimes directing, the miners' lives below. Nutrition was managed carefully to rebuild their strength. Schedules were adjusted. Mental health became a major concern. The miners were no longer abandoned, but they were not free either. A second government, far larger and more powerful, had appeared above them, and the relationship between the two was complicated. The men underground still had to enforce daily order among themselves. No doctor on the surface could personally stop a quarrel 700 meters below ground. No engineer could make men cooperate by remote control. But now the trapped group also had to negotiate what information to share, how to present itself, and how much of its internal life belonged to the public. Because the public had arrived in force. The miners became instant international symbols. Their families were interviewed, their faces were broadcast. Politicians visited the site. Engineers became national heroes. The underground society was suddenly being watched by the entire world. That attention brought comfort, but it also brought pressure. Fame began entering the mine before freedom did. The men were receiving messages from families, but they were also receiving the first hints of the market that would greet them. Interviews, books, appearances, and public narratives were already beginning to form before the rescue capsule ever descended. And that changed things. A group united by hunger does not always remain united by celebrity. Later accounts describe growing tensions, factions, and disagreement over money, credit, private behavior, and public storytelling. The famous Pact of Silence, often described after the rescue, was itself evidence that the miners understood something important. The version of events told to the outside world would have consequences. If there was a democracy underground, it was never pure. It existed inside hierarchy, pressure, exhaustion, and inequality. Some men were more influential than others. Some had stronger personalities, stronger networks, or stronger public appeal. But that is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Real political communities are never abstract diagrams. They are improvised systems built by frightened people with limited options, uneven authority, and urgent needs. The Chilean miners had to confront one of the oldest political problems in history. How do you keep a group together when individual fear could destroy collective survival? You ration, you assign roles, you create routines. You share enough power that rules feel legitimate, and you keep men occupied long enough that panic does not become the main occupation. By the time the famous rescue began in October, the miners had already achieved the less cinematic part of survival. They had made themselves governable. That does not diminish the engineering miracle that followed. The drilling plans, the rescue capsule, the medical coordination, and the extraction of all 33 men remain extraordinary. But the capsule is only the ending. The real beginning of the rescue was social, not mechanical. If the men had collapsed into hoarding, violence, despair, or total disorder during those first 17 days, the world might have found 33 bodies rather than 33 survivors. That is why the rescue capsule can mislead us. It suggests that salvation arrived from above. In one sense, it did. In another, the men had already begun rescuing one another long before the surface reached them. They did it by turning a buried refuge into a functioning human order. Not a perfect republic, not a neat heroic myth, but a rough, improvised democracy of ration tins, work assignments, disputes, routines, and majority consent, built 2,300 feet underground by men who had no reason to believe anyone would reach them in time. The world remembers the machine that lifted the miners out, but before any machine could save them, 33 men had to decide how they were going to live together in the dark. Their rescue began when they started governing themselves.